It's always a scramble to try to get everything in order on this scale to get a global launch. And you have to compare Al Jazeera English to CNN International and BBC World Service TV. I did the very first show. I co-presented the very first show on BBC World Service TV in November of 1991. And that was a much easier setup in many ways because the BBC had a building, it had its facilities, it had a computer system, a word processing system called Basis. We basically pulled a bunch of people out of other areas and created what was effectively like creating a new show within the BBC, except it was a 24-hour channel, which meant hard work and a lot of output. But we had the basic resources and the platform and the framework. It's like saying you can fit out a cabin on a cruise ship and make it something special, as opposed to building a new boat from scratch to sail on the water where you have to test it for leaks and everything. So CNN International was similar in a way. When I joined in May 1993, it was just a small operation within the CNN family, not a fully fledged network as such. And a year later, actually in April of 1994, we relaunched as we saw it, but essentially launched as an international channel, 24 hours self-sufficient. And again, both the BBC and CNN were borrowing material from their parent companies. So BBC World could use BBC News Gathering content. CNN International could use CNN USA content, and they had the infrastructure. Al Jazeera came with nothing except the Arabic channel, which was a different language, different format, standard definition instead of high definition, and a building that was going to be put together. We started off in a small villa in Doha. And it was ambitious because the idea was to build a big center in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, have the headquarters in Doha, have a big center in London, and have a center in Washington, D.C., where I was based. So it was a big challenge doing everything from scratch. So it was actually a fantastic launch when we look at it in real terms. And I think in the time that's transpired since the show that I had on, I had two shows, a live daily show, Monday to Thursday, which was a live interactive issues-based, and then a weekly profile series called One on One. The daily one was just Riz Khan, and the weekly series was One on One. And I think I was very happy with what I achieved. It was extremely tiring, putting out 250 shows a year, roughly, but it worked out very well. And then the idea was to slow down a bit, not to cancel them completely. That's kind of a management decision that I'm still kind of battling. But the idea was to basically slow down a bit so I could start focusing on other things because the pace was just getting to be a lot. Yeah. So, well, it was interesting because in the way that CNN always said that or people always said that CNN's name was made with the Gulf War in 1991. The Arab Spring, as it was labeled, became suddenly Al Jazeera's chance to shine as well, especially as it was one that specialized in the region, having correspondents across the region and having more Arabic language speaking correspondents on board, having this diversity of correspondents and management. So the idea was that we could actually make the most of this by having some more inside knowledge, just not looking from the outside in, as I described earlier. So it was great. It was a great way to test what the channel could do after a few years of being on air and having this kind of solid team in place. What really made it different and challenging for everyone was the growth of social media. And suddenly the buzzwords were crowdsourcing, citizen journalism, content that was pulled off video cameras and having to verify it, having to qualitatively assess it. That was a big challenge because it was a new era. So it was kind of almost in the same way you had revolutions happening on the streets in the Arab world, you had revolution within the media trying to keep up with the new wave of content generation. So I think that was an interesting experiment, not experiment, but an interesting experience for us. And that actually did make a big difference when it came to the growth of the channel into the next step, i.e. respecting the content that could come from the people in the region as well. And this is talking a little bit after my time in terms of my show's ending, so I haven't been party to the inside track of what's been going on, but I'm aware of the issue of criticism in the sense that the Arabic channel has always faced a certain amount of criticism, actually a lot of criticism in the Arab world because of the fact that it was doing something that wasn't being done by any national broadcasters in the region. It was essentially poking eyes into fingers, which is why Al Jazeera became kind of very disliked by Arab governments, but loved by people because they suddenly could see what was going on. But it's a classic case of where the Egyptians loved hearing Al Jazeera talk about what's going on in Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. But when the camera was turned onto Egypt, suddenly they were, wait a minute, what do you mean? And then when it was in Saudi Arabia, they would love watching what's going on in Egypt, but when the camera's on Saudi Arabia, hey, you know. So it's not easy to please everyone, and certainly doing very balanced middle-of-the-road journalism is going to be a challenge for anyone, because people don't come with neutral attitude towards stories. You know, people have that. I mean, a prime example is the execution of Saddam Hussein. As much as many people in the Arab world didn't like Saddam Hussein, they were against his regime, the fact that his execution was kind of made public with the video, the camera footage, the mobile phone camera footage, was an insult to the Arab world. It's like, wait a minute, you know, 1 minute he's a ruler in the Middle East and the West is showing him respect, next minute it doesn't matter, he's treated like kind of YouTube fodder. And I think the feeling of being insulted, you know, kind of made the Arab world feel, or a lot of people in the Arab world feel a little small. You know, you would never do this with a Western leader. So why an Arab leader? Does that mean we suddenly don't have any value? In the same way, CNN was often criticized, you know, for showing the bodies in Rwanda in the mid-90s. 1994, you had massacred, you know, bodies, macheted bodies. And they said, well, you're showing all this because it's black people, but if it was white people, you wouldn't show this. So what is the value of skin color? What is the value of regional ethnicity? And I think that was an example of how it's very easy to upset the emotional balance of any viewer. So yes, the channels had always faced criticism, and all news channels will. And always, you know, it's a case of trying to be as honest as we can to ourselves as journalists. In terms of the coverage, I mean, the time, and I have to say this for the BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera English, I was never told you can say this or you can't say this. It was never said to me, you have to broadcast this or you can't broadcast this. As in anywhere, we were always given a sense of what is a sensitivity. In Britain, there are blasphemy laws, for example. Actually, in America too, there are certain laws you can't cross because in broadcasting, because there are standards that are set so that you don't, you know, incite riots or, you know, kind of religious uprisings and so on. And the guidelines that Al Jazeera follows are the Ofcom regulations in Britain, which are the toughest in the world. So we expected we'd get criticism for anything we did, but as much as I say I don't have any knowledge, you know, I wasn't party to any of the decision making in this sort of post era when it came to situations such as Bahrain. So I don't know what was going on behind closed doors, but certainly in the time I was there was never any sense of you have to do this or you can't do this or you have to, you know. The thing that you always have to remember is that, and again, I'd have to look into it a lot more as myself just to get a better sense of myself, but in many cases when trying to gain access to a story, like just say for example, if you go to a government and ask them to comment on something that's being said by people who are against the government, if the government doesn't respond, it can seem very one-sided. I mean, you can put up, oh, we asked the government, they didn't respond. It still will feel, you know, unbalanced. But it's very hard for me to comment directly on the stuff that I didn't have any access to. But I'm not surprised that there's criticism because it's going to come all the time anyway. On the Arabic channel, I don't know how that operates. And I know the Arabic channel has a different audience, a different agenda, and how much they get contact from anyone on the government side, I don't know. And I honestly don't know. On the English side, we never had anyone coming in from any government kind of position. So, and I don't think the people working in the company itself, in the English company, wouldn't have put up with this because it's ex-BBC, it's ex-CNN, ex-ITN, ex-Sky, even a few ex-Fox people working there. And people would just get up and go. If they said, you know, if you said to them, sorry, but you're going to have to toe this kind of party line or you have to toe this kind of government line, they would get up and go. You know, as long as the Ofcom regulations, as long as the existing international regulations are being followed, no one has any complaints. That's fine. But if someone comes and says, no, you can do this or you can't do this, there's a difference when it comes to, say, religious sensitivities. And I'll give you an example. In the Middle East, if I'm doing a conference or I moderate or speak at conferences, I'm very aware that any kind of humor that might come across as religiously toned, you know, if you say a story and God said this or this, people get very upset because there's a sensitivity to any story that would be about God, you know, because it's considered disrespectful. So I would know in the Middle East I would not, you know, use any humor that would even give a suggestion that there is something that's religiously connotated. In the West, it doesn't matter. People are much more liberal. You can joke about, you know, religion as long as it's not, you know, malicious. You can crack a joke, you know, and know that there's no comeback. Now, when it comes to the same thing with broadcasting, having a better understanding being in the region, people know that there are certain things you can say that are, that maybe in the West would be used wrongly. A phrase like Mohammedan. I would hear this occasionally in Western broadcasting, the Mohammedans, which is a word that is an old colonial word really for Muslims. It's inaccurate because that's suggesting they worship Muhammad, which of course a lot of Muslims get upset with, this kind of idea. Others say, well, okay, it's Western ignorance or whatever. So people living in the region will be aware of their sensitivities, but it's mostly things like religious sensitivities. But certainly no one ever came, in the time I was there, no one ever came to me and said, you can say this or you can't say this. And I doubt very much that anyone who's there now would put up with the same kind of thing as well. The Arabic channel is different. I don't speak Arabic, so it's hard for me to know what the nuances are. But I do know you have to think about who the audiences are. With the English channel, it's a global English language speaking audience. And it's evident. I can listen to it and I can hear. If I hear any of my colleagues use the term I think, I wince, because I come from the old school of journalism where we didn't have opinions, telling a story. You would never say I think, and you wouldn't use adjectives. With the Arabic channel, it's different because it's like in the same way a Fox News is positioned to cater for a certain kind of dialogue and maybe have a position. The Arabic channel is the same kind of loud and noisy kind of channel, and that's what's made it so successful in the Arab world, because that's what people want to watch. But all the studies I've seen, ironically, say the channels are pretty balanced, both of them, the English and the Arabic. And a Swiss company did research on it. And they came out with we look at how much the channel covers this, George Bush, Iran, Iraq, stuff like this, and it was actually quite balanced. But yeah, this, in all honesty, I can't say I never have had anyone say anything to me. I was born in the Middle East, in Yemen, which doesn't exactly have the best reputation as far as certainly as the West is concerned. Aden was a British colony at the time. We left when I was 4 years old. My roots are essentially Punjabi and Gujarati from the continent of India, subcontinent of India, but politically they're essentially Pakistani and Indian. So I'm kind of in a funny position that way. Raised in Britain, and my mentality is very British, right from being in a convent school as a child in Aden, right through to my British education in the UK, and then moved to America 20 years ago. And suddenly it's a totally different way of thinking, and the world has a very different perspective from America. But I'm lucky. I travel at the moment close to 100 flights a year, and I find myself living across different areas in the fact that I'm there equal time in all these places, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And I do find that the only way to get a good idea of what's going on is exposure. People in the Arab world don't all say death to America, which is what a lot of Americans think, and certainly most people in America certainly don't think that every Arab is a killer or a terrorist. And this is the hard thing, to break down these barriers. And how is it done without direct exposure when many people in the Arab world don't go to the US now because they don't want to go through all the trauma at the airport of being profiled and identified and free health checks and all that stuff. And people from the American world don't want to go to the US because I may get blown up. It's amazing how much naivety there is out there. So for me, any kind of media that actually helps to bridge this gap is a good one. Being in the UAE quite a lot, for example, Dubai, Abu Dhabi now as well more, these areas are very multicultural. And people living there can see how it all fits together. You don't get cities more international than that in many ways. Of course you have London, you have New York and so on, but they're kind of old and established, and there isn't the fear associated with London except maybe being mugged, or New York being held up by gunpoint. These are stereotypes too, ironically. So I think anything that can help would be great. But I think that the education that's needed goes beyond the news. As you've said to me, it's like always the big story, the bad story. And I want to be able to move beyond that to say, well, the UAE has the second highest rate of diabetes in the world. And I see it. I said to a friend of mine last week, sitting in Dubai, or in Abu Dhabi actually, look behind you. Look at the state of the people here. There's childhood obesity. There's massive diabetes and issues. I was talking to a laboratory technician who does blood testing. He said, I had an 8-year-old child brought to me whose pancreas was pretty much shot to bits from having so much sugar. And this kid's going to... Yeah, no one's going to have... this kid's going to be on insulin for the rest of his life. So I'm actually trying to identify ways to try and raise awareness, and programming is a good way. But again, it has to be beyond just your conventional broadcast. It has to go deeper than that. It has to engage the younger generation. It has to engage the policymakers. and bring in expertise. So health issues, education issues. You have a huge population in the Middle East, young population, that is desperate for jobs, especially in some areas. And without addressing this, there is going to be more strife and trouble. How can you address peace issues if people are desperate for employment, people are desperate for education, but the education has to be put to use too. So there's a lot of stuff, and I meet, luckily, in my business, in terms of going to events and moderating, people who try to address these issues, but they're not connected. So I'm trying to say, look, I know someone who there's a company, Education for Employment, an organization, an American guy who just put aside his, got a very expensive, wealthy sort of business to say, I want to try and help people in this part of the world so they don't feel animosity. And he's a Jewish American guy, and he wants to help people in the Middle East. But it's an amazing place, and it needs to be addressed that way. And it's diverse. People think everything is like Dubai. No. Everything is like Jerusalem. No. There's so much diversity in that region. If Palestinian kids are shown only throwing stones, yeah, and Israeli youth are shown only in uniform shooting at Palestinian kids, that's the only image you're going to have. This is not humanizing anyone. If Africans are shown only starving and dying and not building a society and building economies that are actually quite strategically valuable now, you're never going to think of them in a human sense. We have to humanize the world a bit more. Well, fingers crossed we'll do it.
Yeah.